thank you all for coming this evening and braving the rain, the wind, the snow, the hail, and occasionally sunshine to come out today. I know the weather has been absolutely mad today. I was worried that there would be a storm this afternoon, and now we've got a gorgeous evening ahead of us. Conscience has always seen aid as a core part of the Taxes for Peace agenda, and long advocated for development and diplomacy as more ethical, effective and economic means of maintaining our national security. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again, but if military interventions were the key to long-term peace and security, then the safest places in the world would be Iraq, Syria and the Gaza Strip. Now, in a world where that is not true, we need to have a very serious conversation about what works. And that's one conversation I think that we want to have this evening. So, at the moment, aid has very, very strict guidelines about how aid can be spent, the kind of things that it can fund. This comes from the OECD. And a lot of government departments aim to do things that aren't military, aren't concerned with security. And unfortunately, at the moment, we're seeing a big shift in that attitude, not only in the departments of aid, but other departments as well. Our speakers this evening are going to be looking at this issue from lots of different perspectives, but we hope that you'll understand the kind of shift that's happening in Whitehall at the moment, where the Taxes for Peace agenda is effectively being undermined because the definitions of aid and the definitions of what government departments should actually be doing is starting to change. And that is happening right now. At the moment, there is a government consultation about what the definition of aid should be. And one of the proposals that is on the table is including different forms of security spending under the definition of what is termed overseas development aid. And Conscience has been very, very active in fighting this, and we've been feeding into the consultations that are happening in government right now. But I also want to look at this issue more broadly. So we've brought in different speakers from different parts of the peace movement to look in this issue in different ways. Opening this evening will be Aisha Dodwell from Global Justice Now, who wrote what I thought was a fantastic report last year about something called the Conflict, Security and Stability Fund, and how that is being undermined by including different types of security spending on it. And then we're going to be hearing from Anne Feltham, who works for the Campaigns Against the Arms Trade. He's going to be looking at the different ways in which the government subsidises the arms trade in particular. And we're then going to hear from Eliot Murphy, who's an academic and lecturer and journalist who's written extensively about the arms trade and austerity and many other political issues. And he's also a representative of Doctors Without Borders at UCL. And finally, we're going to hear from Rim Turkmani, who's a senior research fellow at the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at the Department of International Development, take a breath, at the London School of Economics. She directs the Syria Conflict Research Programme, and her research focuses on identity politics, government, and she's also a women's advisory on the United Nations Women's Advisory Board to Syria. So I think we've got an excellent panel of speakers. Aisha, would you like to kick us off this evening?
Sure.
So have a big round of applause.
If I don't talk loud enough, just wait. I'll try my best to project my voice in that microphone. So, thank you for the introduction. I work with Global Justice Now, and last year we wrote a report on the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund, which is a government programme that we've been monitoring for a while and campaigning to have shut down. So I'm just going to talk briefly a little bit about the fund. So to start off with, just going to introduce a bit of background and context to what this fund is. So I think just to start off with, as you mentioned in the introduction, a really important part of aid spending in recent decades has in theory been that aid should be distinct from national interests, and that includes kind of national foreign policy objectives, security and other objectives of the government. And this wasn't always the case. This was something that was fought for, and so we have in the UK, we have a 2002 International Development Act that enshrines in legislation the idea that the aid must be spent on poverty reduction. And this came about after campaigns to try and make sure that aid was spent specifically on that purpose. And as we heard before, we've got the OECD rules that govern what can count as aid, and that's important because all G7 countries should aspire to having spending at least 0.7 of GNI on aid, and that needs to be counted as aid. It has to very specifically be focused on poverty reduction. So that's, this is a really important principle of where we've got to with aid spending. But in recent years, that principle has come and has been challenged quite a lot. As of 2016, the OECD rules have been expanded to include more of a kind of security agenda in aid spending. In particular, you can now spend aid on countering violent extremism or training for partner militaries. So there's an opening up of what the whole very definition of aid is at the OECD level. And in the UK, the 2016 Conservative Aid Strategy explicitly stated that DFID plans to focus its spending more on national interest and increased its spending very intentionally on what it called conflict states. So all of this is part of, I think, what we can call a kind of securitisation agenda, and it's very much falls in line with aid being spent on what the UK considers its own kind of overseas interests. And that is obviously, a huge problem for aid, which we'll go into, but not least because it means aid is no longer spent where the need is the greatest, which is an really important principle that should underpin aid. And part of this shift really includes aid money no longer only being spent on huge amounts of aid now being spent outside of DFID. So DFID, Department of International Development, traditionally, as of kind of 10 years ago, separated out from the Foreign Office, again with this agenda to really kind of protect aid and spend it on kind of poverty reduction overseas. We now see more and more aid money going into other departments, primarily the FCO, but also other departments, Department of Trade, Department of Defence. And so we see here this is part of this very recent shift in aid spending on kind of security agendas. So with that bit of context, I want to talk more specifically about this Conflict Stability and Security Fund, the CSSF, because this is a really clear example of what I'm talking about. So it's a cross-government pot of approximately £1 billion every year. It's grown year on year, the amount of money that's gone into it, and about half of its budget is made up from the aid budget. So that's kind of 500 million and growing every year. And the idea, it's managed by the National Security Council, so it falls directly under the remit of the Prime Minister, and it's managed by different departments, mainly FCO and DFID. And it funds projects overseas that are loosely related to stability and security that are part of the government's foreign policy, anti-terrorism and security agendas. So I'm just going to talk through a few case studies and then talk about why some of these are problematic. So, for example, in Nigeria, the Nigerian security services are being supported with over 4 million of aid via the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. And a core part of this to provide what is called strategic assistance in the fight against Boko Haram. And Nigeria's security forces have been accused of excessive force and inhumane treatment of suspects, which is, of course, I'll go into some of the problems, but just to give you an idea of where this money is going. So in Bahrain, which is a country that, according to Human Rights Watch, has been known to crack down quite heavily on prosecuting and jailing activists who kind of pro-democracy activists in Bahrain and opposition leaders. In that context, this fund has provided over 3 million over the last 2 years to training of security forces there. And what under this training program has included projects that quoting, train police force in command and control of demonstrators. So this is kind of aid money explicitly going to training police forces in Bahrain in how to control demonstrators who are demonstrating for democracy. And part of this training includes what is called less than lethal options for managing protesters. So that includes things such as water cannons, using dogs to control protesters by the police force. And then there's other projects. 2 million of aid money goes to Sri Lankan police reform and training, and that comes despite the UN reports of what they call endemic and routine torture of suspects arrested in the country. Iraq security services have got 7.5 million in aid via the CSSF. In Sierra Leone, the country's military has got 1.3 million, including for training in, again, public order management. So that's just to give you a bit of a picture of what kinds of things the CSSF is funding. And so I just want to kind of talk about kind of the three main problems with this fund. For a lot of people, they don't see necessarily in and of itself spending aid money on training institutions like police as necessarily a bad thing. That can be an important part of building a functioning state, arguably. And so for a lot of people that isn't a problem. But when you think about aid money and you think about what aid should be spent on in theory, I don't think that training police, military and security forces around the world is likely to be the first thing that springs to mind when you think about how we can most effectively spend money to reduce poverty and you know, ideally also tackle things like global inequality. So, you know, just in itself on a kind of principled level, it really undermines the aid agenda. Like I said in the introduction, this is something that was fought quite a lot, is to kind of protect the aid agenda and make sure that there was a clear focus on poverty reduction. And so, yeah, I think when you blur the lines between promoting what should be some attempt at impartiality in development and aid spending with quite narrowly defined national interest and security objectives, you really start to challenge what aid should be about. Then obviously the second big problem is kind of regardless of whether it's aid or not, because under this fund, like I say, about half of the fund is aid and half is other government money. But regardless of aid, it then brings it then raises more serious questions about what the UK is doing supporting security services that have been accused of kind of human rights violations, and it kind of brings into like much bigger questions of UK's overseas policy and what it's, you know, why it's training these police forces, what's in it, and it's you know, that I think is, you know, an important distinction, that there's those kind of two questions. There's the principle of aid, but then there's kind of questions of what the UK is supporting overseas. And I think linked to that is the third kind of major issue with this fund, is that it lacks any transparency. So in effect, it's become, I mean, actually in a parliamentary inquiry into the fund a few years ago, and one of the phrases that came out from the parliamentarians was it's effectively acts as a slush fund, because no one really knows where the money goes in detail, because there's so little reporting, there's very little transparency. So there's barely been any kind of annual report of where the money goes. There's very vague, if you look on the government website, there's kind of very vague project reports from a few of the projects that are funded, and for each project there's just like an A4 sheet, but that is very, very incomplete. Freedom of information requests are routinely rejected, even parliamentary questions are not properly answered, information is often contradicts each other. So effectively this is £1 billion every year of government money going into a fund that no one really has any proper oversight of, and us as taxpayers definitely don't know where this money's going. There's very little transparency. So yeah, I mean, those are I hope that was clear, kind of the three core issues with this fund. So just to kind of summarise, I was only asked to talk for 10 minutes, so just to summarise, I think there's a bit of good news and a bit of bad news. So I'll go with bad news first so I can end on good news. So the bad news is the government's continuing with the fund, doesn't have any plans to shut it down, and in fact there is reason to believe that they're shifting the goalposts even further. Then the manifesto that the Conservatives came in on explicitly stated under its intentions for development aid that, and I'm just going to read it, what it says. It says, "We do not believe that the international definition of development assistance, which is another word for aid, always help. We will work with like-minded countries to change the rules. If that does not work, we will change the law to allow us to use a better definition of development spending." So I think that's a very clear and explicit warning that the current government has every intention to expand what aid can be spent on, to use it for more projects like the ones I've just briefly introduced. But the good news, not to get political about it, but the good news is that we have successfully secured a commitment from the shadow development team that if they come into power, they will shut the fund down and they will replace it with something called a peace fund, which they're trying to work out what that would look like. But I think that just shows that, you know, there is opposition, and, you know, hopefully there will be continuing challenges to the fund and what it represents in terms of the securitisation of aid. So I hope that was a good introduction, and I'm happy to have a discussion and questions after the other speakers.
I thought that was a very good introduction. One of the things that makes me quite sad about this is that the Department of International Development is actually very transparent with how it spends money. But a lot of the stuff that comes under the CSSF is essentially classified because it's run by the National Security Council, which makes it very hard. And the sad fact is that, you know, we hope, maybe naively, that some of these projects will be very, very good conflict prevention projects, the kind of things that the government should be shouting about, but instead we don't really get anything. But I suspect that a lot of the bad stuff that Aisha talked about, you know, the funding of borrowing for less than lethal training on containing protesters, would be dealt with if the fund was more transparent, because people like Global Justice Now would probably complain about it if they knew about it. So I want to bring in our next speaker now, Anne Felton from Campaign Against the Arms Trade. She's been with Campaign Against the Arms Trade since 1985, and I don't want to drop you in it, but that was the year I was born. And she's the parliamentary coordinator. CAT's work over the years has focused on the UK's government promotion of arms exports, especially to human rights violators. Certainly Saudi has been in the news a lot recently to do with that, but also other regions of conflict. It uses many different methods, but perhaps the most well-known is their use of direct action. Most famously, recently, I think, in the Stop the Arms Fair protests, that actually brought the world's largest arms fair, I think, to national attention in the UK in a way that never was previously. So, Anne, do you want to continue the conversation for us?
Yes, I will. I've been asked to say something about both arms export promotion and the subsidies that go into it, and also about arms conversion, so two kind of slightly different subjects. I think the first thing to say about the arms trade is there's two kinds of sides to it. One is for domestic procurement, which is the kind of UK's Ministry of Defence buying of military equipment, and the other is exports. To a large degree, Campaign Against Arms Trade is focused on the exports, but we're moving across a bit, not least because there's a very kind of close relationship between the two. There is very little that's produced specifically for domestic use or specifically for export. When you get to the factory level or the company level, most are in both. And also, increasingly, the arms industry has become a global one. I've been around long enough, as Sean has indicated, to have seen the industry become ever more globalised. But now you have a so-called UK company such as BAE Systems, which has most of its land services, its tanks and other armoured vehicles, produced in the United States. And conversely, many of the UK supplied bombs that are being dropped on Saudi Arabia from a US headquartered company, Raytheon, but it has Raytheon UK, particularly up in Scotland, which equally makes the weaponry. So it's a global industry. UK governments do not simply allow companies to sell weaponry. They don't simply license it. Since 1966, so we're not talking anything new here, we're talking way, way back, since 1966, there has been a UK government arms export agency, originally set up by the Labour government under Dennis Healey. And every government since then has had this export agency. It's moved around and it's changed its name. It's moved department and it's changed its name. It's now the Defence and Security Organisation, and it is located within the Department of International Trade. It's got 120 civil servants whose sole job is to promote the overseas sale of military and security equipment. Now they work on behalf of these private global arms companies, but they are paid for by the UK taxpayer. Now, a lot of what I'm saying has been kind of summarised in this pamphlet. I've got 2 copies here. It's very detailed, a lot of statistics, quite difficult to dig out. But it details these kind of support that the UK government gives the arms industry. As I say, the Defence and Security Organisation staff work on behalf of the arms companies, but they're paid for by you and me. In the public eye are the prime ministerial visits, and virtually every prime minister has been overseas flogging arms sales. I'm not quite sure Gordon Brown ever did, but virtually every other one. And the other thing that's very much in the public eye is that are the arms fairs, such as Sean mentioned, the one in London last September. But it's actually the day-to-day work of those kind of 120 civil servants in the Department for International Trade, plus civil servants in the Ministry of Defence that run the campaigns to sell major equipment such as Eurofighter Typhoons. Their day-to-day work is at least as important as the kind of headline making news. So obviously one of the things we've always tried to do is get that department shut down. Another big area that special treatment goes into is export finance. The UK government has what is now called UK Export Finance. It used to be called the Export Credits Guarantee Department. Some of you may have heard of it as that. And that is a kind of insurance, government insurance agency. So if the overseas buyer doesn't pay up, the companies don't lose out. They kind of pay a premium, they don't lose out. Some years, about half of all the export credits have gone on supporting arms sales. It varies a lot year to year because one thing you know about arms sales is a big contract might come in, 2013, but then 2014 doesn't have a big contract from anywhere, and then 2015 does. So it's a bit lumpy, but it's one of the big areas which gets government insurance support. Airbus civilian airliners seems to be the other big area. So that's another big set of taxpayer money that is underwriting arms sales. There's support for arms exports, but probably the biggest subsidy of the lot is the research and development funding that goes to the arms companies. That's really massive. That obviously can be argued that's not supporting exports, that's supporting all their equipment, all their research. But it nonetheless is of a kind of quite helpful to the arms companies that they get so much. And if you look at a company such as BAE Systems, the vast majority of its research and development funding is customer funded. That's not all the UK MOD, because some of its customers are overseas, but a very large chunk of it is UK Ministry of Defence funding year on year. So that's kind of the subsidies, and as I say, there's a lot more detail in here, and I can answer more about questions, but how on earth are they justifying giving all this support to the industry? Well, of course, the answer is jobs. Every time, virtually, it's jobs. Occasionally, it's national security. Most of the time, it's jobs. One of the reasons they get away with this is because Margaret Thatcher culled most of the other other industries in the UK, manufacturing industries. So we've got left as the arms industry as one of the big traditional manufacturing industries that's heavily unionised. And I think that's quite important, because sometimes when people say, oh, there are more jobs in education or in health services, the workers will look there and say, but I don't want to be a home help type thing. So we have to look at like we like. But what's also happening is that the arms industry is in long-term decline. And so even the kind of, we need to spend 3% rather than 2% on military spending isn't really affecting the fact that the arms industry is in long-term decline. Some of the military people themselves think that the money shouldn't be spent on traditional armaments, fighter jets or Trident or aircraft carriers, but what we should be spending that money on is cyber and kind of special forces and other kind of other components of military budgets and military make-up, but not the big ticket items. Then again, as I say, the arms industry's long-term decline, where countries do have an arms industry, France, United States, UK, Russia, etc., they're all chasing export markets, all of them, and not all those industries, not all those countries' companies are going to get those export orders. They can't all be successful. And then some of the traditional buying countries are actually developing their own arms industries. That's kind of an arms industry proliferation going on. And one kind of company, one country that kind of springs to mind immediately on this is Turkey, which now with BAE Systems' help is developing its own fighter jet. But it will probably be a slightly cheaper fighter jet than the US or the UK or some European consortium manage. So they will flog it on to other export markets that don't require quite such a state-of-the-art product. It's a crowded market. So it's against this kind of industry that's competitive and declining that the remaining UK arms industry jobs are heavily subsidised. But as the Financial Times pointed out, spending on defence is no better at creating jobs than support for other sectors. Defence R&D may produce spin-offs, but so too may R&D with civilian applications. So I mentioned the government's chosen to give special treatment and support to the arms industry. It's given it subsidies, it gives it ministerial support, it gives it whole departments to help it. A government could choose to transfer that support and put that support into a different industry and somewhere else. And what's happening at the moment is there is renewed interest in arms conversion or defence diversification, call it what you want, moving that support to another industry. I think reasons for that are the Trident debate. A lot of people unhappy about spending on Trident but worry about the jobs. There's the whole business of the arms being used in Yemen. That's another kind of raised the issue with some arms workers we know. And both of those came together and prompted Jeremy Corbyn, when he was standing as Labour leader in 2015, to produce a short booklet on defence diversification. That's all given it the kind of debate about its impetus. So look at the arms industry workers today. There are a lot of them are very, very skilled. Most of the metal bashers of old, as they were, are not there. These are highly qualified science, technology, engineering and mathematical graduates in large part. They are in short supply for other industries. And we would argue that being tied up in the arms industry is actually holding back other sectors of the economy. And the area which most often is suggested as providing an alternative for arms workers, and where there's a match geographically, or could be a match geographically, and with the skill set, is renewable energy. And that needs workers, but the subsidy isn't there. So if the subsidy was shifted, it could employ just as many, if not more, people. In 2016, the nuclear-free local authorities, which is a conglomeration of local authorities, some Labour, many Labour, but also, I believe, some Lib Dems, Scots Nats, and others, they expressed their backing for a shadow defence diversification agency, so that if and when Labour got into power, there would already be something set up, ready to just move in and put defence diversification into practice. They were thinking along the lines of the welfare state when the Attlee government came in 1945. And then in September 2017, the Trade Union Congress also called on the Labour Party to set up a shadow defence diversification agency. That motion, calling on the Labour Party to do so, was seconded by Unite, which is the union that has most of the skilled arms industry workers in it. Unfortunately, the GMB, which has less skilled arms industry workers, and Prospect, which has a lot of Ministry of Defence workers, did not support the resolution. But it did get through with just those two unions not backing it. So it's important to get the message across, particularly, but not only to the Labour Party. There doesn't have to be a choice between peace and human rights and jobs. That the government, given the right government support, there could be both peace, human rights and jobs. And we've got to make sure that that work on that Defence Diversification Agency starts now, Shadow One, so it's really ready when and if Labour gets into power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you in particular, I think, for offering perhaps a glimmer of hope, which I think is something that peace activists need quite desperately, because it sounds like civil society, particularly trade unions, are at least beginning to go on a journey where they can actually see a future beyond the arms industry, perhaps working in other sectors. And I think I was particularly delighted to hear that the TUC have supported a move towards defence diversification. And I'm sure that Kat and others, and I think the Conscience will be involved as well at some point, in supporting this idea of a defence diversification agency and making sure that it is a reality if Labour win the next election. But I want to move on to our next speaker now, and we're going to be looking at this again at a slightly different point of view. Eliot's going to talk to us about how other sort of parts of society fund and indeed legitimise the arms industry and other sectors of defence. So do you want to take it away, Eliot?
Yeah, I'm pretty much going to take off where Anne did, discussing about how the arms trade gets away with it, basically, how it justifies its actions to the public. I'm particularly interested in how public and quasi-public bodies like museums and universities fund and are connected with the arms trade to kind of lend itself an ethical image, social kind of conscience, if you will. So the defence industry has managed to fly under the radar considerably and remain clear of the headlines through lending itself this kind of credibility. This has been achieved principally through a careful integration into public institutions like universities and museums via sponsorships, research programmes and graduate schemes, often with taxpayers' assistance. After the 2016 Brexit vote, senior ministers announced their intentions to increase the value of arms to remain competitive, and naturally Britain obviously wants to cement new relationships with non-EU states, namely the Gulf states in particular. And unfortunately, one of the easiest ways to do that is through defence links. The UK government cleared export licences worth almost £3 billion in the 12 months after the June 2016 vote to 35 countries rated not free by the think tank Freedom House, and this was a 28% increase on the previous 12 months. This isn't too surprising, since leaving the EU makes the UK somewhat less economically secure, and so it's natural for ministers to double down on the country's industrial strengths and corporate connections. So for instance, you probably saw the RT video which has been making the rounds recently, revealing that Theresa May's husband's Capital Group is the biggest shareholder in BAE Systems. And without the hindrance of the consultation and review processes associated with the EU dual use regulation and EU firearms regulations, the UK is in a much more easy position to push unethical arms sales. None of this is to say that arms exports are unethical by definition, because they're plainly not. So throughout the post-Brexit months, the UK rightly licensed £900,000 worth of protective equipment to South Sudan, which is gripped by vicious tribal conflict, which enabled the UN and NGO personnel to operate. Also, approximately £14 million worth of bomb detection equipment was licensed to Afghanistan. Nevertheless, a considerable number of licenses are licensed to repressive and authoritarian regimes. So the arms trade isn't by definition immoral or unethical, it's perfectly fine. It's just it's typically overwhelmingly sent to repressive states. So while the government formally declared to the UN in March last year, as a pretty good example, that Yemen remains a concern, this level of concern hasn't really motivated any such action, as I mentioned, such as cutting ties with the war's major architect, Saudi Arabia. Rather, concern leads to state visits and invites from Saudi leaders. We also can't really talk seriously about the topic of aid, which we are doing today, without taking into account current military operations, since the countries targeted by these two things often overlap. So the UK's foreign policy has increasingly been driven to extremes since the Brexit vote, escalating its use of troops and drone strikes in at least 7 covert wars, without democratic oversight, by the way. So you have a covert war in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Somalia. Since 2010, the UK has licensed over £10 billion worth of arms to repressive regimes and dictatorships, including £7.3 billion worth to states on the Foreign Office's own countries of concern list. But as I mentioned, we want to talk about how the arms trade actually gets away with this. And I'm going to suggest to you that the way they do this is by enlisting the help of a third element, academia, our business. So by establishing rich, friendly connections with a number of public and quasi-public bodies, like unis and museums, the defence industry has managed to cloud many of its practices in scientific sounding developments, like aerospace, automation, artificial intelligence and all the rest of it, all of which in a military context are pretty much code words for arms. So a good example of this can be found with New Scientist magazine. Despite its popularity and credibility, its obsession with technological advances often serves to cloud its ethical judgments about what these technologies are used for. So BAE Systems were the major sponsor of the New Scientist Live Festival last autumn at the Excel Centre, and the decision to accept a major sponsorship from a firm involved in selling arms to a number of authoritarian clients allowed BAE to basically piggyback off the progressive reputation of New Scientist, science more generally, and other companies that were involved in funding and attending the event. So for the duration of the festival, BAE Systems was not an unethical arms supplier of tyrants and murderers. It was a fellow traveller on the road to scientific wonder and discovery, entranced by the cosmos rather than the prospect of £1 million fighter jet deals. That's what we're supposed to believe. Social responsibility was carefully groomed as its main concern, not the maximisation of market share. BAE are also often present at state-held and corporate events in places like the London Transport Museum, the British Museum and the Science Museum, typically due to substantial sponsorships. And along with sponsorships, purchasing ethical credibility, arms firms also have a number of consultancy and research links with major unis. And it's becoming increasingly common for British unis to accept hundreds of thousands of pounds from the world's largest defence contractors to aid them in the development of advanced military hardware, such that they basically act as external R&D departments to these companies. As other sources of funding disappear, in particular post-Brexit, science departments are becoming beholden to the needs of their defence funders and sponsors. So what role do academics themselves, like us, play? The Brazilian philosopher of education, Paulo Freire, wrote how many, both students and teachers, might try to hide in what they regard as the neutrality of scientific pursuits, indifferent to how their findings are used, even uninterested in considering for whom or for what interests they're working. They might treat the society under study as though they are not participants in it. In their celebrated impartiality, they might approach this world as if they were wearing gloves and masks, in order not to contaminate it. These things almost definitely motivate and encourage students to pursue jobs in the defence industry. It's a kind of a sciencey job. It's just about technology. It's not about what these technologies are used for. So to give an example of this, University College London ex-provost Malcolm Grant visited the Arab Spring nations with David Cameron in 2011 to primarily sell arms, basically, during the ongoing forms of state terror. And after a 2-year student campaign, in January 2009, UCL implemented an ethical investment policy, ensuring divestment from the arms firm Cobham, which is a major supplier of Israeli arms. After a Freedom of Information request revealed that UCL had £900,000 invested in Cobham, a campaign called Disarm UCL was formed. And UCL soon became known as one of the Gower Street gun runners. With UCL's admirable history of opposing discrimination, its strong funding of human rights abuses came as something of a surprise to staff and students. I've recently revived Disarm UCL, since although the university no longer holds investments in arms firms, there remain substantial research and consultancy links, with BAE and a lot of other firms too. So a FRI request of mine last year revealed that from 2010 to 2015, UCL had received over £1.3 million from the Ministry of Defence and related departments for various projects, with £340,000 coming from the Atomic Weapons Establishment and £70,000 coming from the MOD. BAE also sponsors the Centre for Ethics and Law at UCL. During the same period, 2010 to 2015, UCL received £3.6 million from the arms trade, bringing the total military-related funding to £4.9 million. The companies funding the university include Aeroflex, Airbus, BAE, Lockheed Martin, Rolls-Royce Power Engineering and Thales. Same period, 2010 to 2015, UCL received 195,000 from BAE Systems, 67,000 from Airbus, 236,000 from Lockheed Martin, and 625,000 from Thales. That's a lot of numbers, but the basic point is that these companies have very, very strong connections with academia, and it's not about education, it's not about teaching people things or about inspiring the next generation of scientists. It's about using the university not just for research, but also to kind of construct a certain image of themselves. BAE Systems was also supposed to be present at a British Museum event that I presented my PhD research at, but when the Morning Star published a story about my request, the FOI request, and the fact that BAE is clearly trying to integrate itself into progressive and humanitarian circles, a few days later at the event, BAE Systems didn't turn up, and they were the only company who didn't turn up with no excuse. And similar thing, maybe they were afraid I was going to beat them up or something. And similar things have happened in recent years all the time, actually. In fact, the slightest application of social pressure, and arms companies back off straight away because they're very frightened of bad press. So at the University of Bristol, Boeing, which makes Apache helicopters used by clients like Israel, Boeing funds scholarships and internships for students, some of whom are working directly on a drone project right now. BAE Systems contributed a £30,000 project to a project at the University of Portsmouth on what they called understanding the moral component of conflict, which probably teaches students something like, in the real world, there's always civilian casualties, and that's too bad, but we should try and minimise them, and when they do occur, it's preferable that they get killed by our weapons, not by another company's weapons. The University of Manchester currently works with BAE on a stealth drone project after the firm spent around £11 million partnering with the uni in 2016. So, as you can probably tell, there's a very clear market dynamic here. Major advances in telecommunications, flat-screen TVs, internet technology and so on emerge from quasi-public institutions funded by the defence industry. And the UK government is, of course, also subsidising the arms industry to the tune of around, I think, £1 billion a year, maybe a little bit less. Just give you another example, University of Glasgow is another major arms investor, with £1.3 million being invested in the arms trade, in addition to over £500,000 worth of shares in BAE, despite the university being committed to socially responsible investment, according to the website. Focusing on university links to the arms trade is really important, but at the same time, I think the Scottish Government, University of Glasgow, should also be held to account. Despite its vocal criticism of the Trident renewal and arms sales to Israel, in 2015 the Scottish Parliament Pension Fund invested just over £500,000 in Rolls-Royce, Meggitt and Ultra Electronics. These three firms have applied for military export licenses to Israel, and Rolls-Royce has a £1.1 billion contract to produce new reactor cores for the next generation of Trident missiles. So the Scottish Government is superficially and rhetorically strong when it comes to clamping down on the arms trade and all the rest of it, but in practice they often fall short of their ideals. BAE is also providing inducements to students to join their company in the form of master's level apprenticeships at Cranfield University, wherever that is, I don't know where that is, undertaking modules including design-driven innovation and cost engineering. In the cutting costs, module teaching will be provided purely online, and it began in January of this year. And 18% of recruits came from the most socially deprived areas of the UK, enticing poorer students with secure career promises. As you know, these are very secure jobs. Many of these students have probably been playing a little bit too much Call of Duty and probably think that a job in the arms trade is cool or edgy or something like that. And again, these universities often don't inform students about the ethical implications of the research projects that they're engaging in. So if you do a PhD in engineering or something at UCL, and you'll probably have close connections with firms like BAE, you're not told up front that this is the implication of your research. This is where your research might actually end up. The University of Surrey also recently aided Lockheed Martin, the US firm, in the development of improved protection for armoured vehicles, while BAE provides Southampton University with hundreds of thousands of pounds in research funding, which allows the academics to publish their papers and teach their courses. In exchange for this, the university performs a research geared towards the business and technological goals of BAE. It's a very smart idea. And by applying this model elsewhere, BAE has connections with around 100 universities worldwide, around 30 of them in the UK, many of which effectively acts, as I mentioned, as external R&D departments. The educational implications of this process aren't really hard to predict. Less independent, creative research directed by passionate principal investigators who care about the science, and more kowtowing to the needs and goals of the private sector. So the modern university is concerned right now above all with profit, and it's more willing to align itself with abusive regimes and rogue corporations supporting unethical firms through investment, research, recruitment, and inviting representatives to give talks on campus, things like that. University career services promote arms companies and invite them to freshers' fairs. I've seen many in my time. Public money is consequently funneled into the arms trade, not just through the usual means of subsidies, quite directly, but also indirectly through university engineering and technology departments, in the sense that universities, which receive taxpayers' money, help arms firms become more profitable. So it's quite a complex web, but it's also, you can disentangle it quite easily. So the reasons for these uni-arms trade connections are several. Among them are a number of myths sustained by the arms trade to keep the public and academic departments on a high alert level amongst supposed looming military threats. So even though the world is currently at its most peaceable for centuries, as Steven Pinker's recent book Enlightenment Now shows very clearly, much of the British public fears existential threats which can seemingly only be combated via increased defence spending. The arms trade has become a natural accessory to the manipulation of public fear levels, and right-wing elements of the government are obviously responsible for drumming up irrational fear levels, but I also think that the radical left bears considerable blame for sometimes over-dramatising the threats to civilization, ideas which can indirectly lead back to people supporting a strong, expanded defence network. Well, how does this relate to the topic of aid? So fueled and sustained by the arms trade, I want to talk a little bit about Africa. So in Africa, the cost of conflict since 1990 was approximately equal to the amount of aid provided by major donors. And instead of contributing to the HIV and AIDS epidemic in Africa, or being spent on health and education and other things like that, over the last 25 years, African states have instead been purchasing weapons from arms producers, with successive UK governments simultaneously providing such sales whilst orating about the virtues of African development objectives and how brave and proud these African people are of their cultural heritage and all the rest of it. Over the last decade, arms sales to conflict and poverty-stricken Angola have been persistently approved and promoted by the UK. HMS Liverpool even docked there to host Angolan political and military officials. So a more general point here is that arms sold to clients like Libya very often trickle down the continent into places like Nigeria, where, as you said, Boko Haram picked them up. A situation which in turn leads to calls for more international humanitarian aid. So it's a very vicious cycle. Such aid wouldn't really be needed in the first place if advanced weaponry had not been sold. So for instance, Peter Weber reported in May 2014 that while Boko Haram used to use AK-47s in 2010, in more recent years they've progressed to much more sophisticated anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, many of which are manufactured by British and French arms companies. Moving slightly west, we've already mentioned Yemen and Saudi Arabia, but I just wanted to quickly give you some concrete examples of items sold to Saudi Arabia. So these include combat aircraft, components for combat and military helicopters, components for military support aircraft, grenades, air-to-air missiles, and components for turrets. Yemen is currently facing a humanitarian catastrophe, and components for turrets obviously aren't going to help. 80% of the population require humanitarian assistance, and even on the very first day of the Saudi-led coalition's attacks, at least 6 children were among a total of 25 killed in airstrikes on a residential neighbourhood, according to Amnesty. On April 19th, 2015, the Saudi-led coalition bombed an Oxfam warehouse containing humanitarian aid. Expressing their moral outrage over this, the UK government approved a £1.7 billion arms export licence to Saudi on May 14th, involving combat aircraft. An airstrike by the Saudi-led coalition a few days ago, as you know, killed 20 at a wedding, including the bride and many women and children. Fears are currently mounting right now over the predicted heavy rains over Yemen and their potential to bring another outbreak of cholera. Over 1 million children were affected by cholera in 2017. In response to this, the UK government dedicated 170 million in aid to the country, although due to its more substantial commitments to arms sales, this paints slightly bizarre, even surreal picture of the UK feeding Yemen with one hand and pummeling its infrastructure with the other. By providing substantial aid to nations where the bloody impacts of the arms trade are felt, the UK can claim moral authority, which it does every day, while simultaneously pleasing many of its domestic electorate, especially up north, by claiming to create and sustain jobs through a thriving defence industry. In Britain, much of the liberal press and commentariat have been quite mute with respect to this clear hypocrisy, and it's quite oddly been the right-wing Daily Express, which actually has a pretty decent record of reporting on the issue, although their motivations for doing so are probably likely based on their hatred of foreign aid more generally. So instead of the government exaggerating a number of national security threats and diverting inordinate amounts of taxpayers' money to private arms firms, Methods of supporting the renewable energy market, as Anne mentioned, could be discussed and properly funded, in turn combating the much more ominous threat of climate catastrophe. The arms trade hindrance of these environmental goals is illustrated well by the creation of BAE Systems of what they called, in February 2016, a newly created role of Chief Operating Officer. This was on their website, which they gave to a veteran of the oil industry, a guy called Charles Woodburn. As the CEO of Expro Group, a global surveyor and manager of oil and gas wells, Woodburn was in a unique position to fulfill the mysterious role, which went undefined on the website. And the closest that we get to an explanation of what this job was came from Ian King, the boss of BAE. He said Charles will strengthen and broaden the strategic and operational capabilities of the business as a welcome and valuable addition to the leadership team. No idea what that means. It's very vague. And it's about as meaningful as most corporate speak, which you're probably all familiar with. The language is always cautiously and very carefully either highly ambiguous or simply meaningless and full of empty cliches. So in case you don't know what I'm talking about, an example would be something like, it's the responsibility of employers to continually provide access to low-risk, high-yield benefits and promote personal employee growth, whilst collaboratively administering economically sound, user-centric materials to authoritatively negotiate market-driven technology, assertively integrate high-quality synergistic infrastructure to exceed customer expectations and stay competitive in tomorrow's world. And it's precisely this kind of language that BAE Systems' website is full of. It's virtually meaningless, and it's designed to protect the company from public scrutiny. Decomposing the language of the arms trade might sound, a bit trivial, but it's also a crucial first step in undermining it and exposing what it's really up to. So I'll leave it there.
It was interesting that you ended on that corporate jargon, because it reminded me of something that happened to one of my friends. Talis came into his university, he was just about to graduate in physics, and they ran a competition to run a laser clock. So he was sitting there for 15 minutes hearing the bump. He ended up winning the competition, and they gave him a prize, and then they said, we'll also offer you a job if you want it. And he said, well, that sounds great, but what do you guys actually do? Because he had no idea, even after hearing what they were talking about. I would also like to have heard, or at least heard the story about how you almost got into a fight with BAE Systems. My money would have been on the arms company, but I clearly didn't know you that well. But thank you very much for that contribution, Eliot. Continuing the conversation is Dr. Turkmani, who is a very well decorated academic. He focuses, I think, primarily on Syria, and she's also been looking at how to turn the war economy into the peace economy. So that's also, I think, very relevant to the discussion we're having here. So do you want to take it away, Dr. Turkmani?
Great, thank you very much. And I would like to start by thanking all the speakers for this amazing work you're doing, research and lobbying. All of you, especially Anne, all these years of lobbying, actually, very, very impressive. Thank you very much. That you're ensuring that our tax money is going to the right place and not just making war. And thank you for Conscious also for doing all that great work and bringing all the speakers here. And I just came from Brussels today, this morning. I was taking part in a conference, which is a donor conference to give all the aid to Syria. This is the biggest donor conference this year, organized by the EU every year. Around this time of the year, and the UK is one of the major contributors to this conference. $4.2 billion were pledged for 2018. Last year, even the figure was larger. And I was asked to speak in that conference about whether how this support and help can be spent in a conflict-sensitive way. What they mean by conflict sensitive is that it ensure that it actually does not create more conflict, and it actually builds on whatever good work is being done, links across conflict lines to build on it. So I would like to take this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about how sometimes the aid money, even if it's not spent directly on arms, on security, it actually is contributing to war rather than contributing to peace. And that happens through different ways, one of which is the war economy, which I try to focus a lot on. But I would like also to say that The government is increasingly aware of this, and they are trying to find ways of how to ensure that the aid which is meant to go for supporting either humanitarian aid or governance or development is not falling into the trap of warlords or war economy, or not inciting more violence or causing more problems. And the research which I do at the LSE, it's part of a large program called Conflict Research Program, is actually DFID funded. And their main question is really what works and how can we avoid to fall into all, this conflict. In a conflict setting, there's always, it's always possible to fall into the conflict traps and to fund the wrong people and for the right money to go to the wrong person. But before going to this, it's important also to say that some of the money was directly spent on arms or on supporting arms groups. Some of it was actually under policing, and I have to say, I looked at many programs, UK-funded programs in Syria, and the ones that were spent on the policing were by far the worst. Because, first of all, you said that the main principle that aid should be distinct from the national policy interest, or especially foreign policy. But actually, most of the UK or European Western contributions to Syria, they are actually very political in a way or another, and they are mainly spent in the opposition-controlled areas. Through ungovernment-controlled areas, they only spend through the UN. So that means programs like policing is only implemented in the opposition-controlled areas. And we're talking about areas where there's almost no governance, there's absolute chaos, it's so difficult to control where the money goes, where the arms go. And if you have a policing, what framework, within which framework does it work? Which, if they caught a criminal, to which court does it go? What's the system? Where does it fit? Who do they report to? So within such context, I think it proved to be very popular to support any kind of policing. So I looked at one of the towns, for example, where they supported such policing program, and I found that the court where this police is connected to has actually members of a terrorist organization, Jabhat al-Nusra, known as HTS. Of course, doesn't mean that the government knew this, but within a conflict setting, this is what you end up with. Yeah. Also, what's problematic is that most of these policing programs, they're not delivered through international organizations. They're actually delivered through private implementers, and they are the most dodgy implementers. Huge amount of money, aid money, goes to these private implementers. Some of them, one of the ones I looked at actually was just like formed overnight in Dubai. It's not even like an organization or an institute with a long experience, a good record. It's been formed recently, but of course it was reforming something old, repackaging something, in a different package, and suddenly get to 10 billion pounds grants to do things in Syria. So one have to raise questions on what is being done through these private implementers, and then they go into the country and they spend, they give astronomical salaries to people. In the area where the best salary you get is like $1,000, they pay $10,000. They really pay a lot. They corrupt people. They end up creating a very corrupt structure and system, and I think they do much more harm than good. There've been other direct contribution to, supporting what they call non-lethal contribution to support the armed groups. But again, in this conflict setting where violence is the main, game, I think it's very difficult to ensure that whatever you're doing is not going into the wrong hands. Going into the money that was meant to be for humanitarian aid and for supporting development and governance, this support usually goes, say, into two main areas, the government-controlled areas or the opposition-controlled areas. In the government-controlled areas, and because the West does not want to have any direct links with the regime, they usually spend all this money through the UN agencies, and few international organizations only that are allowed to work in government-controlled areas. And they only spend on humanitarian aid. So there's no support at all for anything like good governance or development, only purely humanitarian aid. And the rest is spent in opposition-controlled areas, on supporting the local governance, on development, and on humanitarian aid. But very often, so this support goes into the wrong hand if it's not well planned and monitored. And I'll give a few examples. Before going to this, actually, I have to say, when I was asked yesterday to speak about the conflict sensitivity and how can we ensure that the support and aid money is actually spent in a conflict-sensitive way, my main question that I put to all the donors is that by having studied lots of these programs, is I actually queried whether this support is being tailored to be sensitive to the Syrian conflict. It's actually more sensitive to the geopolitical international conflict rather than the Syrian one. And there are numerous examples of this. So no, aid is actually becoming part of foreign policy, and sometimes the geopolitical consideration take priority over the actual needs. Aid should be delivered based on needs. And one simple example is what is called in Syria as the Kurdish majority areas. These areas are run by, let's say, coalition of powers with the Syrian Democratic Forces, but PYD is one of these powers, and probably the strongest player in this area, but it's not the absolute controller of these Kurdish majority areas. Turkey has a strong position with PYD because of its link with PKK, so for them it's a taboo to work in this area. And these are huge areas, and there are huge needs in these areas. And they're not government-controlled areas. So because most of the donors have to Syria have their bases actually in southern Turkey, most of the INGOs are based in southern Turkey, and because of this Turkish taboo, they don't give support to these areas. They're not allowed. If they try, if they support any organization that works in these areas, they will be kicked out of Turkey. And sadly, a lot of the Western support had also to follow this. So that's just an example of how geopolitics sometimes is more important than the actual needs. Another example is when an area changes control. So, for example, you all heard about Eastern Ghouta in the last few weeks. There was a lot about Eastern Ghouta and the government taking control back of Eastern Ghouta. Before they took control of Ghouta, Ghouta was controlled by the opposition. And there was lots of UK-US money spent in Ghouta, not just humanitarian aid, mainly governance and development, which is the right thing to do in my view, because you do need to support legitimate governance in all this area to provide stability and reduce the impact of war. When the opposition left the area and the government took control, everything was stopped overnight, just overnight, nothing, although the needs were actually greater, And there's even more need now to support the governance and rebuilding this area, but everything stopped just overnight for political considerations. Moving into the political economy, the war economy, again, there in all these conflict areas, the economy collapses and it gets restructured again around the only dynamic that is there, which is the war. And naturally, most people's livelihood, even the ordinary people, becomes dependent more on war, on conflict, with what comes with conflict, not with peace and stability and legitimate economy and livelihood. So you get, for example, rather than proper trade, you get smuggling networks. Rather than transferring money through proper institutions, through banks, you have to transfer it through the Hawala system, which is extremely informal system. You don't know where the money goes. You can't trace where the money goes and who's benefiting from it, who's making money from the exchange rate and so forth. Everything becomes informal, very difficult to follow and monitor, which is why it's very easy then for any money or support to become part of this game and to become part of the war rather than peace, even if the money is intended actually to support people. Just think of the ordinary person, for example, who lost their houses, their livelihood, they lost their shop or their farm, and they became dependent on food parcels. Yeah? For 5 years, they can't do anything. They just depended on food parcels. So once you say to them, oh, there's going to be an end to the conflict, and they, oh my God, so we're not going to get the food parcels. How we're going to survive? Yeah. So for them, end of conflict becomes like, oh, but how can we go back to our peaceful good days? It's not going to happen. So let's make sure. I'm not saying they're trying to, but they have this panic that they will suddenly lose the last resort they have. But these are the most innocent players in the war economy. Of course, they are the big warlords and smuggling networks. And one example, again, going back to Ghouta, is the siege. Ghouta was under siege, but actually lots of things were going into Ghouta. It was not an actual siege. I mean, it was an economic operation. Things can go in, but for a price. And who controls what goes in and out? It's a network that have people from both sides, from inside Ghouta and outside. So people linked to the armed opposition, people linked to the regime. And a huge amount of money was being made through this siege. So just to give you an example, the price of a bag of bread in Ghouta a couple of months ago was 2,500 Syrian pound. Today the siege is over, it's 50 Syrian pound. So that all that inflation that was there in the past was going to the benefit of both war parties. And all the aid money that was being spent inside Ghouta had to go through this trap. So part of it was going to the armed groups inside Ghouta, and part of it was going to the regime itself, which is violent and oppressive regime. But the more clear example, and I think one where actually all donors could have done something about, and I spoke a lot about it and no one was ever willing to do anything about it, is the provision of fuel, to opposition-controlled areas. So you've got large areas with many millions, more like 5 million people live in these areas. They do need energy, right? They need energy to cook their food, for heating, for everything. There's no proper electricity, so they have to have generators to have electricity. They need fuel. No one was providing any type of fuel in a legitimate way to these areas. Not even cooking gas. Nothing. So you provide a food parcel with pasta and rice. How are they going to cook it? Yeah, they need ways. Who was providing the fuel? It was ISIS. It was the most extreme actor in the area who was in control of the oil fields, and then refining this field locally, this oil locally, and selling it to opposition-controlled areas. And also the government itself, it had its own smuggling networks which were providing fuel, but in the black market for a price. So that meant a lot of the support that was going to these areas. So let's say, for example, they support the establishment of a school. The school needs heating, needs electricity. They all have to use this taxpayer money to buy the diesel to run all of these. And that money was going directly to ISIS, no one else. Or to smugglers and the regime. And again, that was well-intended money, but it went directly to the wrong hands, and it enabled ISIS to survive longer. And actually, it stopped even the opposition to be able to confront ISIS and to fight ISIS. Because once they did, actually in northern Aleppo in 2015, when they fought ISIS, the provision of the fuel stopped, and overnight the price of diesel tripled. And the opposition was like, no, we can't go anymore. We can't fight there. Yeah, we have to stop, and they did, sadly. Another just final example is through support that goes through the government-controlled areas. Again, mainly go through the UN. And I think the government realized that, this is a huge piece of cake, and I have to have my piece from this cake. So in a way or another, they manipulated who actually is in the UN. So like every, let's say, son of what we call in Syria Mas'oul, like someone, like the influential people, the politicians, they all now have a son or daughter who works in the UN. And this person now, this relative will ensure that the money goes to the people who are from their own networks for a certain sum of money that goes again and feed the most corrupted and violent government in the area. Of course, there are ways to mitigate this through more monitoring, restrictions, but sadly, with having most of the Western governments have cut absolutely all ties with the Syrian government, it was it became very difficult to have any leverage, any influence. I think they should have kept at least certain level of communication to maintain the leverage, but unfortunately it was all lost, and the money that is going into these areas because of sanctions, because of corruption, is sadly a considerable part of it, again, is going to feed and support a very corrupt and violent system. End here.
Thank you. I found that very, very interesting. I think one of the things that really stood out for me is when you don't look at aid holistically, you end up funding a school and indirectly funding ISIS in the process, which is something I found, I think, quite horrifying, and certainly one of the laws, I think, of unintended consequences in a fast-moving conflict zone. And then when you cut off that oil supply, the diesel price triples.
Exactly. I mean, all what they had to do is just to consider that diesel or fuel or even heating gas or cooking gas is aid, classified as aid. Because every time I raise this with governments, they say, but we can't count as aid. It's not aid, but people need it. They need it to survive. And others say, but it could be used by armed groups to run their cars and tanks. And armed groups are managing. It's the people who are not managing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'd like to move on to the sort of Q&A session. We've got about just under half an hour for your questions. So what I'm going to do is maybe take 2 questions at a time, and if you want to address your questions to an individual speaker, we can get them to respond. So who would like to ask a question? Have we solved? We've got one question. Have we got another question? Yeah, okay, yeah, there you go. So this gentleman here, and then we'll go to you. Yeah?
You were talking earlier just about Syria, and I'd like to know why, instead of sending in food parcels that need to be cooked, why doesn't the UN or various NGOs have parcels that don't need to be cooked, that don't need any kind of cooking oil?
All right, and Chris, do you want to?
Yes, thanks. Chris Coverdale from Make Wars History. I find it really excellent tonight, the input, and it struck me as we were going through it that every example you have given about what's going on in this country is now against the law. It is a criminal offence in Britain. It's a little known fact that in 2000 and 2001 the British Parliament introduced 2 new laws making it a crime to fund or supply terrorists or warfare, and in particular individuals and organisations involved in terrorism and warfare. The definition of terrorism is the use of firearms or explosives endangering life for a political cause, which is an extraordinarily broad definition. The Supreme Court has recently said that the military activities of the British government are terrorism under the new Terrorism Act. So my question is, I'm trying to set up a cross-NGO group to start taking legal action against arms manufacturers, against civil servants and ministers and others, because they are breaking both international and domestic law. And I'd be very interested to find out if any of you would be interested in taking part in that group, or somebody in your organisation I could talk to, so that we can move something forward in order to take legal action against what we know is a criminal offence. It's wrong, but it is now a criminal offence in this country. So I would like to hear your responses to that, and also get some information from you so that I can take this ball forward.
So is your question for Dr. Turkmani?
Yes.
Yes. So
Yeah, I think it's it's very difficult and more expensive also to provide everything cooked. I mean, we're talking about very, very high number of people in need, and some of things like baby milk, formula milk, you need water to boil water to provide it. A lot of the aid is provided as just flour, for example, so they need to turn it into bread. They need to run the bakery for that. So it doesn't resolve the problem, they need it for heating, they need the fuel for heating. Some people died of cold. Syria does get cold in winter, really cold, and it gets snow and everything. And we have people and babies dying, because of cold weather, because of the lack of fuel. We had whole forests being deforested because the people had to cut the trees and burn them. They were burning plastic to warm up. I mean, it was really cruel what was happening.
Right. Would anyone like to comment on how conflict breaks the law?
I think. Go on.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think, building and, good luck to that campaign. It sounds great. Something I think a lot of what aid's spent on falls kind of very questionably how much it falls within different legislations. Something that I've always been quite interested in is the 2002 International Development Act, which I mentioned in the context when I introduced the context to the conflict fund. That aid, under current legislation, has to be spent on poverty reduction. So that in itself, before you then go to the kind of more abstract kind of is this the right definition of kind of terrorism, you've just got there kind of ready a kind of very easy case to say is this really reducing poverty? But the clever thing that the government does, of course, is present what they see as, so it can be very loosely defined, what it means to tackle poverty. So, for example, the Priti Patel, who was the International Development Secretary before the current Penny model, her big approach was that the best way to reduce poverty was to kind of push free markets. So therefore, based on that kind of ideological understanding of how to reduce poverty, you can then spend aid on kind of opening up markets, so helping, effectively subsidising companies to enter different markets overseas. So it does become quite difficult. But I think that it's very interesting, your idea.
Is there somebody in global justice who?
You can definitely follow up and send me some more information to them.
Yeah.
Right. Heather, did you have a? Oh, sorry, this one.
I was just going to come back and say, under civil law, not criminal law, campaign against arms trade is currently challenging arms sales to Saudi Arabia, or at least the licensing of those that are being used against Yemen. Even that is very difficult.
Yeah.
We lost in the High Court. We're trying to get permission to take it to the Court of Appeal at the moment. It's a very long process. And what might seem like common sense to most people does not seem to be the way to judges or politicians. On criminal law, I know at least 3 different sets of lawyers who've looked exhaustively at possibilities of charging individuals either within government, the companies, or somebody at high level, low level, the people who load the bombs, or the chief executive, or whatever. There are endless discussions by lawyers who want to take action on this sort of thing, and unfortunately nobody's actually come up with anything. And there's European groups sort of coordinating as well to try and see different possibilities in different countries, because in different countries there are different possibilities legally.
Right.
And actually, as far as civil law goes, the UK is one of the better ones for enabling groups to go forward.
Yeah. So can I contact
you? Sorry, Eliot, did you have something to add?
Yeah, that sounds like a terrific idea. I think the British Army manual's own definition of terrorism is the threat or use of force against civilian populations for political, religious, or ideological means. And so once you actually apply that definition, it just becomes so broad in general that every time the British Army basically performs any action, anytime MOD turn on the lights in the morning, it's basically violating that definition of using it. So it becomes, at the same time, it's great to use it because it's like, oh look, Britain's a really bad state, but at the same time it becomes it becomes hard to use practically, precisely as we've seen here, because you can't even sue the government for. So like in the late 2016, just before Obama left, even the US government tried, and in fact did, cancel a couple of shipments of arms to Saudi Arabia because they were concerned that it was illegal, that it was going to violate international humanitarian law, because these arms were clearly going to be used to violate those laws. Now, if the US can do that, the UK is not doing that. The UK, I think, is much more, by the way, much worse than the US. The US is pretty bad, obviously, but the UK has been the only state, I think, for the last century that's constantly been engaged in military operations somewhere in the world. The only state. Even the US and France don't have that record. So we've become really good at manipulating the law. And in fact, if you watch BBC Newsnight, every now and then they'll have Crispin Blunt or someone, or some High Minister being interviewed about Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And if you put to them the fact that if you show them a picture of a BAE signed bomb, and you can trace it back to a particular sale in the mid-2000s or even the 80s, which have been shown recently, and you say to them, this is violating law, they will just stare at you and say, we have the highest ethical stringent criteria in the world. They'll just say that. They'll just repeat it.
We don't keep to them.
Yeah, so it's just ridiculous. You can't even have a conversation with them.
Right, Heather, do you have a question?
Yes, it's about about getting aid on policing in countries that don't have best record of human rights. Because I guess when the UK does its police training, it isn't just training police officers, it's sort of imbuing them with an ideology of sort of British policing, which is, don't torture confessions out of people, don't beat people up on the street, is part of the ideology that you would hope. If the UK doesn't do this, I imagine these states will still want the training and will look to other places. So you had, when there was sanctions against Zimbabwe, they got North Korea in to train their police and to train their military, who obviously have a very different and far worse set of ideologies. So even if we're only having a small impact fighting back against a government that does not care about human rights, but we're providing some sort of oppositional ideology within the uniformed services, isn't that still better than allowing worse states who will happily fill that gap?
Okay, any more questions? Yeah.
It's a very specific question. I don't know whether any of you have written out your talks, but I would love to get them if it's possible. I think, Eliot, you have got a written thing. Is that possible, or is it sort of copyright, as it were?
No, it's not secret or anything.
That would be really useful.
We'll also be on the YouTubes. Hello, YouTube. So you can get a copy of it.
I just happen to like things put down. So anybody else who's got their things, because I thought they were all really, really, and I'd like to thank you all, because I thought they were brilliant talks, and you really summed up things very well. But I thought all the facts were really useful, all of the talks. So if you've got any notes on them, that would be brilliant.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Yes, at the back here.
I don't know if you've already spoken about it, but if you could say a few words drawing the connection between the industrialized meat industry and war. Now, for some people there may not seem an obvious connection, but in a sense, industrialized meat production is a war on living beings in the first place.
And do you have any more questions?
Sorry, can I ask a second question?
Yes, you certainly can.
It was about the annual budget of being £1 billion a year, and I think this lady said that gave the example of funding to the Nigerian government for Boko Haram, or the way the sort of money worked for Sri Lanka and these other countries. And I was just doing a mental totting up of the numbers that you gave, and it was about 15 million. So where's the other 975 million? Could you give me some sort of idea where that money has gone?
Right. So number one,
isn't it good that Britain is training police officers, because otherwise North Korea might do it? Anyone want to comment on that?
Just, I mean, a couple of comments. I think, you've got very, I've got a more sceptical view on of UK kind of training police forces. I don't know if it's completely coming from a place of wanting to promote great human rights around the world. And there's a lot of problems with UK policing itself. I think a lot of people die in police custody in the UK, just to put that out there. But I think, it's a very, again, like quite a sceptical take on why, what is the purpose for aid money being spent in the first place, and if it is because the UK wants to help other countries build up institutions that are needed for a functioning state, then why can't it spend money? The UK's got an NHS that is something it can be quite proud of. Like, why not use aid money to facilitate national health services around the world? There's a lot of other uses for aid that would more convince me that there was such a generous thought behind it. And I think, just to say as well, a lot of with aid spending, you have to, poverty isn't a technical issue; it is a political issue. And so the idea that you can just, go and plug some money into a particular training program and therefore you've kind of addressed all these kind of deeply political issues is kind of flawed. Sorry, and I'm going off track there, but it just kind of that question triggered that for me. And to talk a little bit about the budget. So this particular fund, like I say, it's a 1 billion annual fund, and like I said, it's very difficult to track exactly where the money goes. But there's up to 70 countries that get this money, and it's huge amounts of money get poured into things such as training police forces in opposition-controlled areas of Syria, which is something that was a big scandal just around December last year when one of the projects had to get stopped by the Foreign Office because it was found that police forces were also involved in kind of stonings and beheadings and stuff. It was kind of proper kind of scandals that obviously helps feed the anti-aid agenda, which is part of the problem with this fund. So where does the money go? It's poured into all sorts of places, but a really important place that it does go, and you touched upon it, is these private contractors. So most of DFID's, not just DFID, most of this money and the kind of model of UK aid spending doesn't get spent directly. It's not just bilaterally given, we've stopped budget support, so it's not going straight to governments. It goes through via third-party contractors who obviously cream off huge profits. So you've actually got a really booming aid industry. So you've got huge, I think, so under the CSSF there's a number of kind of what they call approved partners, which are private contractors. So you get private contractors like Adam Smith International, who are the contractors that were implementing, the training programs in Syria. But then you've also got people like G4S. You've got all these private companies. Loads. You've got all these private companies. Some of them are kind of known for being quite bad, and some are just, like you said, completely unknown private companies that can bid for these contracts. And huge amounts of money is going to those private contractors. It's the question of where exactly the money goes is exactly the problem, because we don't know. And I think someone said earlier that DFID's quite transparent, and again, I would kind of question that. In theory, they're transparent because they have this database called DevTracker, but I challenge anyone to go on there and find out where aid money gets spent, and it's not easy. I think the fact that I can't answer it is my answer. The meat industry question is very specific, and I don't know if Anne knows of arms companies and equipment being used, but I don't think I can answer that question.
No.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, you can ask a
Yeah.
question if you like.
No, I have a question
I
to
was
you
thinking I might ask a question,
on the CSSF funds that there said there's very little information, but usually they commission evaluation reports for these programs. Did you ever ask to ask these reports, and would they show them to you? I mean, I did this once for some of the 50 programs, and I was shown the evaluation reports for different types of spending.
So it's extremely superficial, any evaluation. I think the first annual report for the fund was produced 2 years ago, and it's incredibly short for £1 billion of UK money. It says 70 countries, but nowhere can you find that information listed. I have put freedom of information requests to try and get evaluation reports, and it's incredibly difficult. You're backwards and forwards being rejected with stuff. And a lot of the reason, and I'm sure you might find similar stuff in your work, and like a lot of the reason that you get rejected from getting this information, a lot of the reason that contracts are redacted are because of security issues. So say if you're working in a kind of conflict state, we therefore can't tell you who we're giving money to because it's dangerous for them. And it's just kind of a blanket answer that's given, a bit like quite often you get blanket answers of commercial confidentiality. It's that kind of excuse that we don't want to give out public information. But something I find quite interesting is at the same time that government will say we can't tell you who we're giving money to because it's because of security reasons, you can then go look on the private contractors' websites who obviously want to promote the work they're doing because they've got to, that's the business they're in. If you're in a contractor, you're constantly selling yourself. They'll say, we're implementing this DFID funded project in Afghanistan, but if you go on DFID, they'll say, we can't tell you who we're paying to implement projects in Afghanistan. And that's very interesting because it obviously shows what a kind of excuse, the kind of security rationale is for not giving out the information.
Yes, with us it's usually it's more often commercial confidentiality. We've also had the experience where names were taken out of a document and put the job titles into LinkedIn, and we found virtually every one of them. So I mean, obviously the government was more sensitive than the individuals concerned about their jobs.
I mean, just to add as well, maybe coming back to the kind of sceptical answer to the police training, is that there was, for anyone that's looking into it more, there was a so there's a body called the ICAI, which is the independent kind of aid watchdog for UK aid spending. They recently published a report on the CSSF, and even they're very neutral. They can't be accused of any kind of ideological kind of oppositions or anything. They show that it's like, just be at a minimum, it's just very superficial. Like, you can say, yes, we've done this training course on human rights, but what does it really mean? Like, okay, so some bums sat on some seats while someone did a PowerPoint. Like, it's very superficial what it actually, to showing what results you're actually producing.
I've got a comment to the police question.
Can I just comment? I also read that report by ICAI, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact. I may be a little more sceptical if they're that independent, given they're entirely funded by the government and based in Whitehall. And the report I think was very confusing. Like, I think the total report was given a yellow rating, whatever that means. And a lot of the projects I think were about 3 or 4 paragraphs long. And this can chart 2 to 3 years worth of work. So they're extremely vague and very, very hard to decipher. Sorry, Eliot, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, the police question that you asked. You were saying, is it preferable for UK police to train as opposed to North Korea? Was that the?
Or just if you are a state that is not particularly nice, and you probably want the training anyway, you either get the West going in and giving their ideology, or if there is some sort of sanctions or ban that stops that, you go off looking for equally nasty or even nastier states who are willing to do that training with their ideology.
Right. Well, you should read a book called Cruel Britannia, A Secret History of Torture. I forget the author. He talks about the history of torture in Cruel Britannia, strangely enough. And there's a really cool chapter about how even in recent history in Bahrain, British police training there led to really horrific human rights violations in terms of torture, really bad stuff. Also in Kenya in the 1950s and early 60s, There were concentration camps set up when Britain was occupying, and this was all run by police. It was a police job, and the most horrific form of torture took place there. You had concentration camps where they played the British national anthem. It was like Nazi Germany, except in the 50s. They tortured people by chopping off men's private parts and shoving them in their mouths and taping them until they suffocated. The most horrific, gruesome acts of torture by the British police. You don't do that these days. But at the same time, when you ask, should we have, our training versus North Korea, there's no institutional racism in North Korea. Koreans don't care about things like that. In England, there's substantial, much more unusual forms and subtle forms of oppression and unfairness than in North Korea. North Korea, they have authoritarian policing. They hit you over the head and they force you to march, fine. But in England, there's way more sophisticated, advanced scientific methods of torture, which are really smart and very clever, which the Koreans probably don't do. And they also haven't had the chance to. Like, when was the last country they invaded? They haven't got much experience in this. Britain's got really great experience when it comes to policing very well. So I would probably go for North Korea.
Very interesting. Would I want to be tortured by a British person or North Korea? I think that's a question maybe best left to the philosophers, actually.
Well, I'd like to make a point of information to Eliot. Lockheed Martin ran the British censors 10 years ago. They also had the contract to supply the freelance interrogators to Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. That's Lockheed Martin.
I'd like to ask a question, and because you gave me hope, which is always a dangerous thing to do, I'm aware that this idea of defence diversification has been around a while. Do you think that this movement by the TUC perhaps spells that this time it's possible?
Yes, because I think the arms industry is declining anyway, as I mentioned. In November 2016, there was a meeting in Birmingham, a conference in Birmingham, to commemorate 40 years since the Lucas Plan, which some people here may remember or have heard of, which was Lucas Aerospace workers finding working out alternative work that they could do that wasn't armaments, and doing it in a kind of bottom-up way and all sorts of other kind of good things. Anyway, there was a conference in Birmingham, November 2016, and a quarter of that conference sort of looked at arms conversion issues. And from that, a group spun off, a mixture of people working in trade unionists, few peace organisations, Scientists for Global Responsibility, that sort of thing, CAT, CND, several trade union bits and pieces, and nuclear-free local authorities that I mentioned earlier. And it was from out of that group that the motion went, first of all, via the Trades Council movement, the kind of National Trades Council movement, to the TUC. That was September 2017. And yes, I think it has got some weight behind it now, at least if we get a Labour government. People are pushing it a great deal. We know the shadow teams are talking about it. So it's very important. It's very important it goes as part of industrial strategy into the biz. I think I've been around, as you said, a very long time. I've never, since the very early days when I was around, have known so many poor people talking about arms conversion. And it makes a lot of sense. And I think people should be talking about it and pushing it, because it does kind of square the circle, as it were, of a lot of people being very uneasy about selling arms to human rights violators or countries at war or whatever. Or the militarists who think that an aircraft carrier isn't the what's needed to defend the UK in the 21st century, as it were. So it's got a lot of things coming together at the same sort of time, and I think that kind of is really helpful. And yes, I'm quite optimistic about it.
Excellent.
Right, should we?
Can I just
can we move to?
to
Because we're pushed for time. Can we just move to the closing?
I just wanted to get people's ideas of what to do about the problems.
Right. I want to move now to sort of closing statements. Just 1 or 2 minutes from each speaker. Can we start with our last speaker and maybe work in reverse order? So just start on the discussion.
Can we start with someone else?
Right,
Okay.
Yeah.
What can we do about it? So Novara Media had a discussion with Diane Abbott the other day, Ash Sarkar, I think it was. She interviewed Diane Abbott, and they had a very deep discussion about what do we do if we just do purely economic arguments. You sound kind of dry and stale. On the other hand, if you just present purely moral arguments, you sound like a bleeding heart. How do you bridge that divide? I tend to think that the best way to do it is simply give the public the facts. Just tell them the facts, and the moral intuitions come naturally. You don't need to tell them, oh, and by the way, it's immoral to like sell weapons to Saudi Arabia who are bombing Yemeni children. You don't need to say that because it's just obvious. You just give them the facts, and they'll be like, yeah, okay, that's pretty bad. So I think, I mean, unless you're a psychopath, then you'll make the moral argument by yourself. Yeah, I think moving forward, the jobs argument is the thing that needs to be undermined the most, because it's the most important, but also because it's so easy to undermine it. The fact that skilled jobs can easily be transferred to the renewable industry, renewable sector. What else? Yeah, you know, the fact that, let's see, halving, it's been shown that halving military spending in the UK would create jobs, since government resources could be more productively sent elsewhere. And the arms trade, in fact, drains a lot of skills. A lot of very smart people, very, very bright people, PhDs in mathematics, instead of going to work for Google or MIT, they go work for BAE Systems instead. And in fact, in the 4 decades prior to 2006, only 7% of terrorist groups were defeated through military means. 83% were defeated through political progress, and the other 10 just disappeared and went away into hiding. So the idea that military strategy is the way forward is not good. Again, these figures are really important. Most people don't know this. Most people don't have a clue. Most people live next to BAE factories, Nottingham, North Yorkshire. These provide jobs. These provide a sense of security. If you undermine that, it can be a bit worrying, because you're thinking, well, I'm not going to have a job. Britain's going to be attacked left, right, and centre. If you provide these arguments, I think you'll probably find you'll have more sway. What else? Yeah, I guess this. I was going to close with this quote. Julian Barnes has a novel called The Noise of Time. I don't know if you've heard this. Came out a couple of years ago. Very good novel. And I find this quote really useful when it comes to understanding the morality. I mentioned Paulo Freire's work before about the scientific mindset. I really think it's important not just to be too political about this, but also to talk about the psychology. And don't be afraid to talk about the mindset behind people working in the arms trade and why they do it. Why academics just focus on science and not think about the ethics and all the rest of it. Anyway, he said, as for Shakespeare, he wondered, looking back, if he hadn't been unfair. He judged the Englishman sentimental because his tyrants in the plays suffered guilt, bad dreams, remorse. Now that he had seen more of life and been deafened by the noise of time, he thought it likely that Shakespeare had been right, had been truthful, but only for his own times. In the world's younger days, when magic and religion held sway, it was plausible that monsters might have consciences. Not anymore. The world has moved on, become more scientific, more practical, less under the sway of old superstitions. And tyrants had moved on as well. Perhaps conscience no longer had an evolutionary function, and so it's been bred out. Penetrate beneath the modern tyrant's skin, go down layer after layer, and you'll find that the texture doesn't change, that granite encloses more granite, and there's no cave of conscience to be found. And you see that really easily. Like I said, the Newsnight interviews, you just interview people, Crispin Blunt, for instance. You tell them the facts, you show them the images, you bring them to the scene, you do whatever you physically can, and they will not change. They just don't have it in them to understand that they could do anything about it. So I think it's up to us to kind of force that image on them instead. Yeah.
Right. Aisha, do you want to come in next?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe just picking up on kind of what do we do. So I guess, yeah, I think undermining the job arguments that Anne's put out is obviously kind of really crucial, as is, I guess, not believing the kind of the propaganda or the narrative that we're told about that facilitates the security agenda. So the kind of the fear narrative, it's really important to oppose that, and I guess ultimately remember that, you know, when we talk about security and the security agenda, that ultimately, like, security isn't about kind of states bombing each other to ensure that we don't bomb each other and no one else bombs each other. It's, you know, real human security is about having access to kind of a meaningful life, and that's the kind of security, and that's the kind of security agenda that we should be kind of pursuing.
Can I just pick up on that, because that's exactly what I wanted to say, and what we actually recommended some of the papers we produce in our research unit is that states should move from the state-centric security paradigm to a human security paradigm, so that the security is not about the security of the state itself and protecting itself from other states. It's about the human being, whether in or outside. So whether the human being in Syria or in the UK, it has to be about the security of the individuals, not the states. And here inside the UK, I think the work you're doing is great. I think more needs to be done along the same line. Policy advocacy work that is evidence-based. You know, great research you're working, raising the awareness. I think need just to scale that up. Abroad, I mean, also to do something similar. I mean, working with civil society. I get most of my ideas and from working with civil society inside Syria, similar groups to work you're doing, but in a different country, and they see things more also from human security lens, and they care about the individual and their security, not just actual security like food security, stability, everything. And I think continue to work with civil society and seeing things through their eyes. Then you see how the conflict is seen from the bottom, from below, not just through the geopolitical lens and the the foreign policy interest. Once we know what people want, ordinary people, civilians and civil society, then we can find ways to align their needs and interests with the foreign interest and hopefully provide better aid.
And your minutes?
Yes, I had 3 points, one of which is, again, I would very much reinforce what is being said about changing the debate about security. There is in this very building on the 15th of June, which is a Friday, a conference on rethinking security that is looking at just those sort of topics, that's being run by a kind of collection of different campaigning groups. So that's here on the 15th of June. And part of that discussion is reclaiming the language, so that defence isn't seen as synonymous with security. I think getting the language back. The second thing is, Eliot mentioned under the legitimacy that the arms companies seek by kind of teaming up with things in universities. I think we should continue to do that. I think the good news is the Science Museum says it won't host arms companies again. The arms companies, BAE Systems had to drop its sponsorship of I forgot what it's called, the Great North Exhibition or whatever it was in Newcastle, because a lot of the artists, in the kind of broad artist sense, musicians, arts people, who were going to take part in this big festival of the North, said they wouldn't do so if BAE was involved, so they had to withdraw its sponsorship. So that's all part of a kind of undermining of that legitimacy. And then I would take issue with you earlier. I think there is some redemption on some of the militarists. My favourite one of those, and he would never talk to me, but that's fair enough. Sir John Stanley was a Conservative Defence Minister. He then, as a senior backbench MP, chaired between 2010 and 2015 the Committees on Arms Export Controls. That's the backbench committee that scrutinised arms exports. And when he got that there was a contradiction between promoting arms sales and promoting human rights, he really got it. And he spent the last 4 years of his time as a parliamentarian, he retired in 2015, he just beavered away and unearthed stuff about the arms trade that was just so valuable. And he managed to use his position as being this kind of really typical defence minister. That really helped in him kind of changing viewpoints and minds. And so I think that is possible. He's the most extreme example I know, but there are others as well.
Right, well I think if somebody who's on the Committee for Arms Control can have a Damascene conversion, I think there's hope for all of us. Right, before we wrap things up, I'm going to say a few words. First of all, what can we do next? Well, to all of you, join the Conscience campaign is the first answer. But the second thing that I want to talk about is what the Conscience campaign is going to be doing over the next few months, because there's a lot happening in the Conscience office right now. Now, one thing that was mentioned, I think particularly by Anne, is this idea of a peace and disarmament minister in the Labour Party, a guy called Fabian Hamilton. Now, we think that's a really good opportunity to have some peace priorities put into government. So Conscience has commissioned an academic from Warwick University to actually look at this issue and develop policy proposals and look at what the challenges might be for implementing such a ministerial position in government. That's currently in train now. That's something we're already doing, and we're hoping to launch it with Fabian Hamilton in June of this year. And we're going to be reaching out to across the peace movement. We've consulted widely to ask individuals to contribute to this report, and we want you all to be there to support it. And it was raised to me tonight that the report really needs to go out and be seen by the peace movement, I think, before it's finalised, because we want different organisations to feed into the final report as well, to make it as strong as it can be, because this is essentially the peace movement's opportunity to have one of our guys in government looking at the issues that we care about. So this is not an opportunity, I think, that we need to miss. It's something we need to make the most of, and Conscience will be playing a role in that. The other thing that Conscience will be looking at over the next year is working with trade unions to promote this idea of defence diversification. Now, I will admit that Conscience is late to the party on this compared to organisations like Campaign Against the Arms Trade, but with the Trade Union Congress passing a motion that said it will lobby the Labour Party to set up a defence diversification before the next Labour government comes into force. That means there's an impotence between the people who essentially fund the Labour Party and the Labour Party itself. So we hope that some of that energy can be transferred into potentially realisable results. But it's something that's going to have to kick up the agenda of the trade unions, because they've got a lot on their plate. They've got low pay, they've got the issues around austerity. All of their membership are feeling the strain in different ways. So making sure that defence diversification actually gets a voice in a very difficult political environment is going to be hard. But it's something that the peace movement is going to contribute heavily to make happen, and that's something that we are going to be looking at over the 6 months about how we can get involved and contribute to that conversation. And I hope that Kat will talk to us about how we can help the work that they've already been doing on this particular issue. Conscience will also be selling this idea of Minister of Peace at every single party conference this year, to make sure that it's not just the Labour Party who are keen on this idea, but other parties as well, because we have no idea how elections are going to go in this country. Will there be another coalition? Will there be a Labour government? Will there be another Conservative government? I think the peace movement needs to look at all of the parties and make sure that this doesn't just become a Labour Party idea, but something a bit more mainstream than that. Now, if that is something that you guys want to be involved in, then you need to join Conscience and help us achieve those things. Now, I would like to say thank you to all our speakers, because frankly we had excellent speakers this evening who are expert in a variety of different fields, covering some really interesting and diverse topics. So we'll get a big round of applause for our speakers today. And finally, thank you for coming along this evening. As they sort of say, the real conversation starts now in the pub. Everybody obviously join up to Conscience at the back there, but also speak to our local groups development officer, who's going to be setting up local groups across the country. If you're interested in starting a group in your area, you need to speak to this person. She will help you do that. Her name is Sweater, so she will help you do that. And another thank you is to Faye, who's our events volunteer at Conscience, who made this event possible and coordinated all our speakers. So a big round of applause for her. If you'd like to join me in the pub, I'll be hanging around for about 10 minutes, and then I shall be going to the Euston Flyer just down the road. Okay? Oh,